Hello and welcome to the first of a series of lectures on the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era is a period in American history from 1900 to 1920. It is a period of tremendous reform, political reform, government reform, economic reform, social activism, civil rights activism. It is one of the most important, profound periods in American history in terms of propelling us to the modern world, where we are today. So the Progressive Era is a profoundly important period in American history, and we're going to spend a series of lectures exploring what led to the reform movement, who the reformers were, and what were the reforms that they were able to create, and what were the impact of those reforms. Now keep in mind that this period also covers the era of World War I and America's involvement in World War I. So the World War I story, which we will handle at the end of this unit, is also part of the Progressive Era. Now in this lecture, we're going to talk about the genesis of the Progressive Era. We're going to talk about the Progressive Reformers, who they were, and what it is they were trying to achieve. So let's begin. So by 1900, there was a general sense that industrialization had changed America. Everywhere you looked, America was hurling headfirst into the modern world. Now, the effects of industrialization were not felt equally everywhere. Places like New York and Chicago were the most modern places on the planet. They were the most technologically advanced. They had the latest goods, the latest technologies, and these cities were being transformed in every sense of the word. If you went out into the countryside to the areas where the farmers lived, then it was like jumping back in time. It was truly like going back to a bygone era. It was like going back to the early 1800s in many ways, because even though the countryside felt the economic impact of industrialization, and we've explored that before, a lot of the technological impact of industrialization simply hadn't been felt yet. Think about things like telephones, telegraphs, electricity. These were common features of the cities by 1900. In fact, by 1900, public transportation is a real thing. They are starting to construct the first subways, which are one of the features of public transportation in most modern American cities. By contrast, there was, you were still in the horse and buggy days back in the countryside. So the impact of industrialization in terms of the technology was not felt equally, but the changes wrought on society and the economy were certainly felt across the United States, whether you were in a city or the countryside. Industrialization had changed the economy and how it functioned. It had changed transportation networks. It had changed the very fabric of society through immigration. There were just many more different peoples in the United States, all of which came here because of industrialization. We were truly becoming the most diverse country on earth, with immigrants from all over the European world and all over and also from Asia. Now, we've talked about the complexity that industrialization brought, the prejudice, xenophobia, nativism, and hate directed towards immigrants, particularly immigrants of Asian heritage. And so we have seen that industrialization brought with it all sorts of issues, be they social issues about American identity, or just fundamentally about how the economy works, social inequality, economic inequality. And by 1900, most of the country agreed that industrialization had changed this country. And that led to a movement of people, a group that we collectively call the Progressive Reformers, who believed they had identified the quote-unquote problems within America, and they were now offering policy solutions to solve these problems. Now, I put the word problems in parentheses on the slide here because I want you to be aware that what many of these reformers considered to be quote-unquote problems were not problems at all. They were simply issues that this particular group of Americans did not want to deal with, or did not like the way in which this particular movement or consequence of industrialization that they identified. They didn't particularly care for the way in which it had changed or was transforming America. So when we get to the quote-unquote problems that these progressive reformers identified, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, keep in mind that a lot of them aren't problems per se. They are simply changes. And that gets to one of the interesting cruxes of the industrial era. In general, the progressive groups wanted government action. They believed that the challenges of the industrial era demanded new policies, programs, agencies, laws, and even constitutional changes. But there was no consensus among the reformers about the idea of change. The reformers are not unified. We're going to go through that in more detail in just a moment, but I really want to drive this point home right now. There was a general sense by 1900 that quote-unquote reform was necessary because there were quote-unquote problems that had been introduced into the United States because of industrialization, as a consequence of industrialization. And these quote-unquote reformers are proposing government policy, laws, agencies, constitutional changes. They're proposing a whole host of ideas to address what they have identified as problems. But keep in mind, this is a diverse body of people. There is no consensus about the changes that should be enacted on society, culture, government, and the economy. Okay? There's general consensus about the idea of change, but the reformers were not unified in their outlook or in their solutions. They were not unified in what they had identified as problems, and they certainly were not unified in what they proposed as solutions. And so we have to be very, very careful when we look at this era, when we look at this movement. The progressive era is a general term, a collective term for all these reform movements. But this term, progressive, can often lead us in a incorrect or inaccurate understanding of this era if we don't really define this word. So today, when we use the term progressive, what we mean, it's largely used to well, the root word here is progress. And the word progressive today is largely used with respect to center-left and further left-leaning movements. So today, people who identify as progressive, or when you hear the adjective progressive applied to a concept, a policy proposal, a bill, or a law, it usually means that we're talking about something on the left. We're talking about something that is more liberal or on the left, the left side of the political spectrum. That is not totally what we mean by the word progressive when we're describing the progressive era in 1900 to 1920. Yes, much of the reforms and the reform movement and the reformers themselves of the period 1900 to 1920 could accurately be described as being on the political left. They were left-leaning groups. And we'll talk about who some of these groups were in just a moment. But in general, a lot of the progressive reformers were on the left. They were politically more liberal. They were politically more on the left side of things. But the progressive reform era also had a whole host of conservative reformers, groups that were more traditionalist and on the right-wing side of the political spectrum. And so this creates this interesting dichotomy about the progressive era. It is one of the most important periods in modern American history, and it is a profoundly transformative period in American history. Without question, the reform movement and the reforms that were achieved during the progressive era will profoundly transform American society, American economy, and the American government and American political system. That is without question. And many, if not most of those reforms are on the left side of the political spectrum. However, the progressive era is also a profoundly reactionary period. It is a period in which conservative groups were reacting to the changes that they saw created by industrialization and reacting from a place of negativity. They didn't like these changes that had been introduced because of the industrialization. And so the progressive era is also a deeply reactionary and conservative era as well in many respects. And there are significant conservative proposals that will become either legislation or law during the Progressive Era that will also have a profound impact on America. So just really keep in mind that even though we use this term progressive to describe this era, it doesn't necessarily mean exactly what it means today in modern political discourse. All right, let's spend a little bit of time talking about the reform groups, these reformers who are going to drive the Progressive Era. And the reason we want to talk about this is it gives you a sense of the diverse groups and the diverse perspectives that are all hammering for reform policies. And this gives you a sense of just the diversity of opinion and diversity of perspectives and the wide variety of peoples involved in political activism during this time period. So one of the most important groups in this are labor unions. Labor unions are one of the most important aspects of the Progressive Era. In the previous unit, we talked about labor unions and their attempts to gain concessions from industry, business, and commercial groups. And we talked about the labor wars, which were literally strikes and work stoppages that could very quickly morph into violence, both local and more widespread. And we talked about the small gains, but also the large obstacles that labor unions faced in getting better wages, safer working conditions, better work hours, better benefits for their members. And if you recall, one of the biggest barriers was government itself, that local, state, and federal government officials tended to side with business and corporations and thus provide assistance to decisively defeat strikes and labor movements. And so labor unions became quickly aware that if they were going to make any progress, they needed to gain real political traction. They needed to gain political traction at the local, state, and especially the federal level to enact change. They understood that only through federal and state law could they get the transformations and changes that would benefit their members, the workers. So labor unions are a big constituent group of the Progressive Era. Second group I want to talk about are anti-corruption crusaders. We've addressed this a little bit, but there was tremendous corruption in politics during the late 19th century. We addressed machine-era politics and the political machines that largely existed in urban areas. We talked about the influence that corporations and big business had on government and the way in which big business could have a tremendous amount of influence over local, state, and federal policy. And so these anti-corruption crusaders were largely focused on political corruption. These were especially journalists. The journalists not all journalists, but many journalistic outlets and many writers began to investigate factories and mines and meatpacking facilities and logging towns and logging camps and logging mills and the railroads and their relationship to government, and they began to investigate politicians. And what they discovered was a shocking amount of corruption in our system, and the way in which pursuit of profit often led to corners being cut and led to all sorts of dangerous things happening in workplaces to workers, but also dangerous things happening in products that the general public consumed, especially the food source. And we'll talk about that in a subsequent lecture. And so these journalists began to investigate it and publish stories in newspapers and magazines, publish books, and really reveal the depth of corruption within corporations, within economic processes like factories, but also within government itself and corrupt government officials. These journalists were so successful one of the most important presidents of the Progressive Era that we'll talk about in the next lecture, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt often found himself angered by the revelations of these journalists and these investigative reporters, because they often hamstringed his own attempts at reform, or they often revealed the way in which his reforms didn't go far enough, or were not aggressive enough. And Theodore Roosevelt often called these journalists the muckrakers. He said, because they just stir up the muck. And these journalists actually took that pejorative nickname and wore it with pride. And you'll often see political cartoons at the time, or journalists from the time, proudly referring themselves as muckrakers. And if you want, you can read lots of books on the muckrakers. There's even a very famous collection of some of the most famous pieces of reporting, newspaper articles and magazine articles and excerpts from books from this time period. And it's just called The Muckrakers. And it's a collection of some of the most profoundly important works of journalism that from this time period. And where the journalists are important, where the anti-corruption crusaders are important, is they're revealing to the public the depths of the problem. They're informing the public about what the scope of the issues. Now, some in the public were aware of this through direct experience. They might have been miners or factory workers or loggers, etc. Or they might have felt like corporations had too much power just based on, the rates that they had to pay to ship their hay to market or their livestock to market or something like that. But what these journalists did is really revealed the depth of the power and control that business and corporations had over the economy and political process. The third group that are involved in this are immigrant rights activists. Immigrant rights activists. These are people who advocate for the rights of immigrants. And this is really a diverse group of people. They're diverse in the sense that almost every immigrant community has immigrant rights groups within their neighborhoods, and some of them have larger national groups. On the one hand, some of these immigrants' rights groups are like fraternal orders or cultural groups dedicated to preserving and protecting the culture of the old country, if you will, be it language or religion or festivals or other cultural traditions, so that they're not lost for future generations. And so you have organizations that are dedicated to teaching students, or teaching young people Chinese or Japanese or Swedish or Italian, or if it was a Jewish group, Yiddish and Hebrew and all sorts of groups. They're dedicated to preserving the old culture so that it didn't die out in the face of enormous pressures of assimilation, like we talked about in the previous unit. But some of these immigrant rights groups went further. They were activist groups that were fighting for protections against marginalized groups, against marginalized peoples. We've already seen some of this with the Chinese American community. There were groups that emerged in those communities to fight back illegally against the persecutions that they faced that we discussed in the last unit. So immigrants' rights groups emerged trying to fight for immigrants' rights. And immigrants' rights groups often made alliances with labor unions, which makes sense because many immigrants were involved in industrial jobs. And so many of them were part of unions. And so immigrant rights groups and unions often work together. At the same time, if you look a little further down on our list, also part of the Progressive Era are nativist groups. Nativist groups, as you recall, are anti-immigrant groups. They are groups that want to get rid of immigrants. They are groups that want to restrict immigrants. They are groups that want to ban immigrants. There are groups that think immigrants are destroying America because they are changing the culture of America. And nativists are inspired often by social Darwinism and eugenics in their view of people who do not fit the description of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And nativist groups are often making alliances with labor unions as well, because many labor unions believe that immigration is just providing more and more cheap labor, which is hurting existing workers from getting the concessions from business and corporation that they want. And so just in looking at labor unions, immigrant rights groups, and nativists, you can see the both the tensions and the contradictions within the progressive movement. These are all progressive reformers, and some labor unions are embracing immigrants' rights groups and working with them because those are their members. And some labor unions are nativist in their outlook and working with nativist groups. And nativist and immigrant rights groups are not wanting the same policies at the same time. They're both part of the tapestry that is the progressive movement. They each are identifying a problem, and they're wanting government to act. And this is something we're going to focus on in the next few lectures, but I really want to emphasize right now, the progressive era is about government action. They're asking government to take a role in affairs that they had typically not played much of a role in. Even though the major belief at the time for the economy is laissez-faire capitalism, the idea that you just don't regulate the economy at all. By 1900, these groups, there is a sense among these groups that some regulation of society and the economy is necessary because of the changes introduced by industrialization. Immigrant rights groups often want protections for immigrants. Labor unions want regulations of companies and corporations. And nativist groups want the government to act to restrict or wholeheartedly block or ban immigration. And so you can see the vast differences that are all under this kind of umbrella that we call the progressive reformers. Also among the progressive reformers are civil rights activists. You have civil rights groups emerging during this period for two reasons. One, this is the period in which Jim Crow laws in the South are becoming crystallized, right? This is the era immediately after Reconstruction is over and immediately after Southern states have passed laws, rewritten their constitutions to marginalize and exclude African Americans from political process. They have made it almost impossible for them to vote, essentially denied them the right to vote. They have made it very difficult for them to participate in the political process. They have gerrymandered the legal system against them to the point where justice is almost impossible for African Americans to achieve in these states. And then they are using systematic violence in order to enforce this disenfranchisement and this segregation and this oppression. At the same time, right, we see out west the impact of allotment and assimilation on Native Americans. And we have seen persecution of immigrants and restrictions against immigrants, particularly, right, Chinese immigrants. And so civil rights groups emerged to push back against the oppression of people of color, of women, of groups that are marginalized by dominant culture. And so in some ways, the civil rights activists, there are some overlap with the immigrants' rights activists because some of these groups have some overlap. But the civil rights activists are also deeply engaged in reform that has nothing to do with immigration, but just about the rights of communities within America. And so, the most famous and important group founded during this time period is the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, which was founded in 1909. This was and remains the premier African American civil rights organization in the country. It was actually initially founded primarily by white people who had a particular view of what they wanted the American black community to be like, and they opposed much of the oppression of the South, but their ideas of equality were certainly not our ideas of equality today. And so many of the founders of the NAACP were actually white Americans who excluded many black civil rights activists from their ranks simply because they thought their vision for America was too radical compared to these white civil rights activists who were organizing the NAACP. Now, probably the most prominent African American activist and name of the founding of the NAACP was W.E.B. Du Bois, whom we talked about and read in a previous unit. So he is one of the founding members. But the NAACP is not the organization that it will be later on during its founding. But it is a civil rights group. There were other activists and groups among Native American communities that are organizing to push back against the colonialization and oppression of the reservation system. You guys read a couple, and we talked about a couple in the previous units. Kalasa or Carlos Montezuma are examples of this. And so these individuals are beginning to push for reform and for legal protections and for the federal government to act against discriminatory, prejudicial, and segregational policies. Another group we want to talk about are the suffragists. Suffragists are women and men who are advocating for women to have the right to vote. Suffragists have been active in the United States since the founding of the country, and they became more organized beginning in 1848. And when a conference was held to kind of coordinate and formalize their petition for the right to vote, and the suffragists have been active in every decade and every era that we've talked about up to this point, advocating for women to have the right to vote. This intensified in the late 19th century with African Americans getting the right to vote because of the 14th and 15th Amendments, each African American men getting the right to vote because of the 14th and 15th Amendments, and then also because of immigrants and the 14th Amendment granting birthright citizenship to immigrants, to anyone born on American soil, meaning the children of immigrants, if they were born here, would automatically be granted citizenship. And we talked in the last unit, the Wong Kim Ark case of 1898, confirming that. And many of the suffragists suffragists themselves are a very, very diverse group, a diverse coalition who are all what is called first wave feminism. And first wave feminism is about getting the political right to vote, at least in Western countries like the United States. And so this coalition is a very diverse group of people, all with one goal: getting women the political right to vote, and as a consequence, serve in office. That said, the suffragists tended to be a very diverse group of people, particularly among the women. And to be clear here, there were men who were part of the suffragist reforms, but women, of course, were the bulk of this movement. And the suffragist women, there was a huge diversity among them. On the one hand, you had wealthy WASP women, right? Wealthy, white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant women. And these women were infuriated because black men and immigrant men, if they had a path towards citizenship, or the children of immigrants, would have the right to vote and not to them. And among many suffragists, you'll see horribly racist discussions of immigrants, particularly immigrants of Asian heritage, but also of Jewish heritage and of Eastern European heritage and of Catholic heritage, be they Italian or Irish. You'll see horribly racist discussions of black men. And they will say they have the right to vote. These men who are citizens from these various non-WASP communities have the right to vote, and we don't. That is unconscionable. And it is unconscionable that they don't have the right to vote, but they're making a racist argument in their rationalization, at least among many of these WASP women. On the other hand, you will get women in immigrant communities who argue that women having the right to vote is the only way to get serious economic and political reforms. Many anti-corruption crusaders are making this point. Give women and all women the right to vote because you're going to help working class women, immigrant women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the suffragists, in many ways, are a group that really reveal the diversity of positions and the tensions that exist within these reform movements. Churches played a very large role in the progressive movement. Many church groups looked at this period of the late 19th and early 20th century of the industrial era as a period of moral failing. They said that these cities were quote unquote dirty, corrupt, filthy places filled with crime because of the immorality of our era. They said that in the countryside there was poverty because people had forgotten God and forgotten the church. And so religious groups, particularly Christian groups, play a really large role in the reform movement. As you might guess, much like the nativists, the churches tend to be reactionary. They tend to be more conservative in their view of their solutions and their identification of the problems. The churches tended to believe that the issues were not economic inequality, racial inequality, hatred, nativism, racism, oppression, exploitation, corruption. They tended to not identify those as the problems. Instead, they tended to believe it was a moral problem due to a lack of faith or people not living up to Christian virtue. And so churches tended to want to push particular policies around morality, be it policies encouraging church attendance or policies criminalizing actions that Christians consider to be antithetical to Christianity. They tended to push those policies. One of the biggest policies that churches were involved in were the temperance movements. These were movements against alcohol, to have alcohol banned. The idea here is that it was this widespread belief that alcoholism was the real source of the economic inequality and suffering of the working class and of quote-unquote problems in immigrant communities. And if you just eliminated the alcohol, it would all people that suddenly problems of poverty and inequality would disappear. Now, whether or not alcoholism was a widespread problem is impossible to say. We don't have statistics on it, but what historians can tell you is that eliminating alcohol is not going to eliminate racism, prejudice, and inequality and exploitation. It's just not. And we don't even have to speculate about that because, as you're going to find out, alcohol is going to get banned, and yet the inequality, economic, social, racial, and the prejudice and the oppression still continues. But churches were heavily involved in this. We've already talked about nativists. They are an example of a conservative reactionary movement, right? Disliking the changes of industrialization, but not necessarily the economic changes. They disliked the social and cultural change. That people that they considered beneath them were immigrating to this country, and their culture was becoming part of American culture, and their culture didn't conform to ideas of WASP, and informed by social Darwinism and eugenics, they were developing ideas and hierarchies to justify and rationalize their prejudice and their hate. Nativists had already were quickly gaining victories at the state and local level. And they were gaining victories at the state and local level through something called miscegenation laws. So miscegenation laws, we'll talk more about those in the 1920s, but these laws effectively forbid intermarriage between certain groups, particularly black people and white people. And many states began to develop them in the early 20th century, and we'll talk more about that. But this is an example of the kinds of policies that nativist groups who were informed by social Darwinism and eugenics, which rationalized and justified their hate and their racism, right? They were involved in policy. They wanted certain policies, and at the state level, they were starting to get them. We'll talk more about them in the next unit because it's more important to talk about them in the 1920s when they become much more widespread. And then the last thing we're going to talk about are business owners. Business owners, industry, also were heavily involved in the conversations around the progressive era. In some cases, some business owners recognized the need for reform. And in some cases, it was simply reactionary, pushing against reform, but they are very much actively involved. So, this is your introduction to the progressive era. In short, the progressive era is a reform movement involving a variety of actors and players, all pushing for government action on economic, political, social, and cultural issues. In many ways, they are building upon the legacy of the populists of the late 19th century who had been pushing for political and legal reforms. What the progressive era is going to do is take a lot of those ideas and just broaden them and look at a much wider variety of issues that they believe need to be addressed. But remember, there's a diversity and tension within the reformers. They don't all agree on the same problems. They don't agree on the same solutions. All right, in the next lecture, we'll talk about the Theodore Roosevelt administration, which is classically seen as the first progressive administration and the first implementation of reforms that begin the progressive era. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.